This is video AS1, Assessing ELLs, Background. It provides purposes and requirements for assessment in addition to guidelines for teachers. What is assessment? In general, it involves 1. The selection or design of appropriate assessment methods, 2. Implementing the assessment methods and gathering data on how well students have achieved the expected learning outcomes, 3. Examining, sharing, and acting on assessment findings to improve student learning, and 4. Examining the assessment process itself. In other words, assessing the assessment. Another way to define assessment is on this slide. Assessment is the systematic collection, review, and use of information about educational programs to improve student learning. Assessment affects every part of the curriculum and instruction. There are several purposes for assessment. For example, standardized assessments have as their goal accountability. Politicians, administrators, and program coordinators use the results of standardized assessments to talk about what needs to be done in a general way. Traditional classroom assessments, meaning usually closed and structured assessments, which are summative, in other words, for a grade or score, are for evaluation. This means that it's the end point. Alternative assessments, on the other hand, are formative. That means they're open-ended and their purpose is for feedback, including performance assessments and portfolios. Parents, teachers, and students are the stakeholders in alternative assessments. All types of these assessments are necessary, and none alone is sufficient to provide information needed by all stakeholders. The federal government, in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also currently known as No Child Left Behind, requires that ELLs take the state high-stakes test. However, it's not all bad news. For ELLs, NCLB allows for certain accommodations. For example, students have a 1-year testing exemption in reading and English language arts if they're new to the country. However, that means that they still have to take the science and math. Without the reading and English language arts skills that they need, it's unclear how that can happen though. Students also have the possibility of taking the required exams in their native language if they are offered. In Washington State, the MSP, for example, is offered in Spanish, Russian, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Somali. At this time, students can listen to the test questions on a CD, but must answer in English. According to the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, this covers about 80% of the English language learning population in our state. However, if students cannot listen and answer the question and understand the questions in English, they'll have a hard time responding in English. Finally, another accommodation is the use of appropriate testing accommodations such as small group administration of the test, extra time, dictionaries, and simplified instructions. However, these are optional and don't always occur. In addition to the required content exams, ELL students must also take an annual English language proficiency test to demonstrate English language development in reading, writing, listening, and speaking every year. States are required to have English language proficiency standards in place to guide instruction of language development. In Washington State, the Washington English Language Proficiency Assessment, WELPA, is available for placement and the annual test. The Office of Migrant and Bilingual Education in the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction has developed English language development standards upon which the test is supposed to be based. Find out more about state assessments in the videos ELLs and the law. However, accommodations for these tests are not mandated. ELLs usually take a placement test, typically the state-mandated English Proficiency Test, or WELPA, discussed in the previous slide, and then take the test yearly. Districts and schools can also make their own additional requirements, which sometimes include locally developed tests. Classroom assessments for all students can be in part mandated by school or district, sometimes using tests that are part of the commercial science, math, and reading kits. However, they are always in part up to the teacher. Guidelines for classroom assessments include teachers should assess all objectives, language, and content. Teachers should focus on students' ways of knowing in multiple contexts. In other words, students should be able to show what they know in the ways that they know it. Teachers should use both formative and summative assessments to both help students understand their processes and to have grades that explain their progress. And teachers should combine alternative assessments with the standardized assessments that are required. Find out more about this in video AS2. What about grades? Teachers have the option to score content knowledge and language proficiency separately and comment on both. In this way, it's clear that while students do have some content knowledge, perhaps their language knowledge is not as good, or vice versa. What do you understand from this video? Test yourself by taking the quiz on this page.